So a lot of people are wondering about this new vaccine. Is it dangerous? Is it somehow related to the mark of the beast? What about the nanocrystals, luciferase enzyme, genetic engineering behind the completely new form of vaccine? I want to give you some information that you may not have had access to so far to help you better think through some of these issues, and then do with it what you will. But let me address first of all the question about, is there a relation between this vaccine and the mark of the beast? Is it in some way the mark of the beast discussed in the book of Revelation in the Bible? And secondly, though we'll talk about this before closing the video, what if this in some way paves the way for the government to have greater control? Perhaps it's not the mark of the beast itself, but maybe it paves the way. How should we respond to that? So first of all, why don't I think that this is in any way related to the mark of the beast? The mark of the beast is described in the book of Revelation, chapter 13. Now is as good a time as ever to open the Bible and spend time reading what God's word itself actually has to say about this. And the Bible's pretty clear about this. It was written not to scare people, the book of Revelation in particular, not to scare people about what might happen in the end times and be uncertain, are we or are we not in the end times at the moment, but to prepare people. The same way when you get on a flight, you're preparing to fly, and you're given instructions on what will happen and how to respond when an airplane goes down. It's not meant to scare people, but to give them information in advance, because during a crisis, people tend to panic if they don't know, what they're supposed to do and that the situation is under control if they respond properly. That's what Jesus says in the Gospels when he tells the disciples, I'm telling you this in advance. When you see these things happen, know that the end is near. So there's some pretty clear indicators. The mark of the beast is a mark that is to be received on the forehead or right hand, which are two areas that symbolize authority over the individual. The right hand is of strength, and the forehead, your head, the decision-making part of your body. And they symbolize allegiance to a beast, the beast that comes out of the earth, in opposition to the God of heaven. This beast is serving another beast, the beast that comes out of the sea, who has blasphemed God openly by this point, has blasphemed the temple, has ordered that those who stand against God be put to death, and he's been given power to do this by God himself. In fact, one of the first things we need to think is that the book of Revelation doesn't tell us how to keep these things from happening or how to resist them or slow them down, but how to be perseverant and faithful when these things do play out. Now, the vaccines currently available, are they a mark that we have to receive on our forehead or right hand? Clearly not. Is everyone forced to receive them? Are people exempted? No one is exempted from the mark of the beast. Well, of course, people who have immune problems are exempted, and several other categories of people are exempted from getting the vaccine. In fact, the question isn't, will you be put to death if you don't receive it, but will you be able to get the vaccine given the limited supply at the moment? And what does this vaccine represent? Does it represent, do you declare your rebellion to God, or do you blaspheme God or enter into the service of someone who is openly blaspheming God and putting people to death for not having served God? None of this. So clearly the vaccination campaign in progress, as with all previous campaigns, doesn't have the hallmarks of being the situation described in Revelation chapter 13. And we'll talk about later if it's in some way paving the way. But let's talk about some of the other concerns with this vaccine. What about the nanocrystals? So things that a doctor named Carrie Madej has particularly championed online. Let's talk about nanocrystals. Nano just means very small. So anything below the micro level is in the nano level. And on a microscope, you see things that are measured on the micro level. You go meters, millimeters, micrometers, and then nanometers. Now, nanocrystals are therefore very, very small crystals, and some crystals of these sizes, not all crystals, salt is a crystal, will respond to light in certain ways. Now, MIT several years ago did a study to see if they could inject these crystals into a person's skin to create an invisible tattoo that would last a certain number of years, because skin is constantly replaced. Would this tattoo be in any way harmful? Would it be able to last a certain number of years? And the idea was to create tattoos that would be invisible, but might be useful for keeping information that you might want to show one person, say your doctor, and not other people. Therefore, you'd want it to be invisible the rest of the time. So by injecting these crystals with a specific pattern, you need to use a patch, a microarray patch, so that you can inject the crystals in some areas of the skin and not in others, and create a pattern. You could create an invisible tattoo, they demonstrated. And it would only light up when you shine a particular light on it. And at that point, you could see what was written in that tattoo. Is this necessary for vaccination? No. People talked about we could use this to be able to have a record of vaccinations. It may be in an area in Africa where people lose their documents. These are theoretical ideas, a little bit of speculation. Maybe people who their government is in uproar, their village has been destroyed, they don't have access to their documents, but they have an invisible tattoo. Could it be done? And they showed, yes, it could be done. But it's not necessary for vaccine itself to work. It would be a way to have an invisible tattoo. Is this used with the current vaccine? Actually, despite what people are saying on the internet, no, it's not. Because, first of all, you need a micro array of needles. You need to use specifically the patch. If you use a needle, like the ones we're seeing with most people who receive the vaccine injections, you would only, if you had a nanocrystal in there, you would only get a pinpoint, and a pinpoint that lights up doesn't tell you anything. It's not useful as an invisible tattoo. So no, nanocrystals aren't necessary for the vaccine to work. They're not present as an ingredient in the vaccines that are being developed for the coronavirus. And in any event, if you don't have a microarray, you wouldn't be able to create an invisible tattoo that would actually say anything. What about luciferase? I heard there's an enzyme that has the name Lucifer in it that someone patented. Well, actually, luciferase isn't an enzyme that someone patented this year or last year. It's a whole family of enzymes that exist in nature. Fireflies are able to create light through a chemical reaction using an enzyme in the luciferase family of enzymes. These enzymes were named luciferase enzymes in the 1800s. Someone, decided that the Latin lucifer, light bearer, was a good way to describe these chemicals, and not particularly caring about the connection with the figure of Lucifer, the light bearer in the Bible. So it is definitely an unfortunate name, but it's not something people have invented now, and the enzyme itself has nothing to blame if someone decided to name it the luciferase. Fireflies have had these enzymes to produce light ever since God created them, and it's a good thing. And sometimes these chemicals are used in lab studies to be able to see things. You might want things to light up using a chemical reaction. But again, they're not necessary for the actual vaccines to work. So 140 so vaccines are being developed at the moment for the coronavirus. It's possible that in some lab studies, people have worked with these enzymes, but they're not necessary for the vaccine. They're not part of the vaccine. You don't generally want a chemical to light up in your skin after you've received the vaccine. There's really no reason for having that. But these are new vaccines. They're completely new. No one's ever tested them before, and they use genetic material from a virus. No one's injected, non-human genetic material into us before, have they? Isn't this genetic engineering? And won't it create autoimmune diseases or cancers or other problems? Well, first things first. It's not true that we've never had viral DNA injected into our cells before, because that's exactly what a virus does. Um, the herpes virus is a DNA-based virus. It injects its DNA into our cells and then uses our cells to produce the proteins it needs to be able to create new viral particles, reproduce its DNA so it can create multiple copies, create new viral particles, and infect new cells. So every time you've had the flu virus, any of the viruses that cause the common cold, you've had their genetic material in some of the cells of your body, a large number of cells of your body, fortunately not all of them. And your body fought that off, but they actually entered your cells and began to manipulate your cell's mechanism to be able to create proteins and reproduce their genetic material and create new viral particles, and that's why viruses are a problem. In some cases, like the hepatitis B virus, they can actually integrate, the DNA from the virus can actually integrate into the genome. But I know people who have had hepatitis B and none of them turned into transhumans. It can become a problem, can make you more likely to develop a liver cancer, for example, in that case. Others, like HIV, are also capable of integrating in the genome, this time starting from RNA, using a special enzyme that the HIV virus has but coronavirus doesn't, that converts RNA to DNA and then integrates in the genome. And again, people who have HIV don't turn into transhumans, even though it does, the genetic material does interfere with our own DNA, because it doesn't affect all the cells in our body, thank God, and our body fights against this. But that's not even what's happening with an mRNA vaccine. The coronavirus, therefore, if you get the coronavirus infection, its full RNA genome will enter your cell and will begin to produce several different proteins that it needs in order to be able to reproduce itself, including the spike proteins that will be on the surface of the new viral particles, but with a whole host of other protein structures that in the vaccine are not available. The vaccine is only capable of producing, it only takes that part of the code that will produce a protein and not the whole rest. And being an RNA virus with no reverse transcriptase enzyme, it can never enter our nucleus or alter our genome in any way. So no, it's not a form of genetic engineering in that sense, that it would somehow change our DNA or change our children's DNA. The mRNA is actually very fragile. That's why they have a hard time storing some of these vaccines and delivering them. And it's not true that it's never been tested as far as injecting mRNA in a lipid into people before. Besides that viruses do this all the time with the full viral genome, they've been doing experiments with this since 2011, at least, human clinical trials, and even before that with animal studies. And also in these cases, you haven't had people suddenly developing cancers or their immune system completely failing or other problems like that. So 2011 to 2020 isn't exactly yesterday. We have seen what can happen, if anything would happen a few years down the line with these systems. But it is the first time that it is being used by researchers, it's the first time that researchers are using it for an infectious disease rather than trying to cure specific types of cancer. And in that sense, this year is the first time it was tested, but it's not that it hasn't been tested at all. It went through animal studies at the beginning of this year when they first discovered the genome and found the sequence to be able to develop these mRNA vaccines. After the animal testing, there were phase 1 and phase 2 human clinical trials for the Moderna, Pfizer vaccines and the other the 140 or so vaccines that are being developed. And all of the studies, all of the side effects that people had are available. They've been published online in the various journals, New England Journal of Medicine, for example, for the Moderna vaccine, and through the World Health Organization website. So when people are talking about, they had so many adverse reactions, it's not because they have access to data that no one else has seen. I can access the data, you can access the data just as easily as a Kerry Madej or Rashid Buttar or Frank Schallenberger or any of the other doctors and former doctors online talking about these vaccines. And so what do these studies tell us? In the phase 3 clinical trial for Pfizer, for example, 44,000 people were enrolled. That's the size of a small city. 44,000 people enrolled in the study and divided into placebo and vaccine groups. Some people receiving a placebo, basically nothing, a neutral injection with no harmful materials in it, and the others receiving the vaccine. And then they have to know if it works or not. Well, they don't just expose people to the virus. What they did is, starting from July, is they gave people either the vaccine or the placebo without telling them, and in some of these studies, I don't know about the Pfizer study specifically, even the doctors giving the injections didn't know whether they were giving placebo or vaccine until some of these people eventually come across the virus, because you have a small city in terms of the number of people, 40,000+ people. Several months down the line, some of them will randomly come across the virus. They'll be infected. And when they test positive, at that point, the people who are involved in the study are allowed to open the papers and find out if they've given them the vaccine or the placebo. And what they found is, at the end of November, of 170 people who had tested positive, 162 of them were in the placebo group, and only 8 of them were in the vaccinated group. That means basically, while over 100 people in the placebo group had received and been infected and tested positive for the virus, they came down with coronavirus, almost no one in the vaccinated group did, only 8 people. That's where they were able to say we have a 95% success rate. And as more of those 44,000 people, they're going to keep track of them for the next 2 years, come across the virus, the more that they test positive, the more we should see those numbers growing. And it seems like the placebo group is the one where you're going to see all the people testing positive, 162 versus 8 so far. That's why the percentages can go up from one day to another. Did these people have adverse effects? What about, I heard some people died. Well, 6 people did die in the Pfizer study. Now, you're talking about 44,000 people being tracked for several months, from July to November. That's a small city. If you keep track of any small city for several months, a few people do pass away. You can't have 40,000 people and wait for a long time and not have anyone pass away. But when they do pass away, you have to look at why. Any clinical trial will see some of the members enrolled die over the course of the trial because there's so many people involved. So they looked at, why did they die? Did they die of a heart attack, or did they die of something that could be related to the vaccine, like an allergic reaction, especially connected to the moment of injection? And 4 of the people who died were actually in the placebo group, so they hadn't received anything that could have triggered death. And the 2 people in the vaccinated group died of heart and blood vessel related problems, which again is nothing to do with the vaccine. A person who passes away because of a heart attack. So know that of 44,000 people, no one, it's been several months now for some of these people, has come down with any sort of syndrome that would make you think that they're transhuman or now have an autoimmune disease or that it's going to kill them. And actually, we've seen of tens of thousands of people tested, basically none of them getting the virus, only 8, compared to tens of thousands of people get a placebo and 162 of them get the virus. So it definitely makes a difference. Is it in any way more dangerous than the actual virus itself? Well, let's think about that as well. 200,000 people in the United States have to date been vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine after, this is after the clinical trials. 200,000 people, and the CDC has logged 6 serious allergic reactions. Not people who passed away, but people who did need medical care. They needed to have adrenaline injections, they needed to be watched, and these usually show up within 15 to 30 minutes after the injection, so there's a very clear connection. 6 out of 200,000 injected. If you get 200,000 people who have had the coronavirus, I'm thinking in terms of numbers that we've seen here in Italy, where I'm at the moment, 7,000 out of 200,000 pass away. That's the death rate, the mortality rate. 3 to 4% mortality rate is 7,000 people. So 200,000 vaccinated, 6 adverse reactions that can be dealt with, versus 200,000 people getting the coronavirus and 7,000 of them dying, not to mention others having to spend tens of days in the hospital. There's a definite benefit. If the option was, if I don't get vaccinated, there's no way I'm going to get COVID anyway, that would be different. But unfortunately, the chances of getting the coronavirus are quite high right now. So you have to balance the risks and the benefits, and definitely the risk is quite low. What about some of the sources of all of this information? Carrie Madej, Rashid Buttar, Frank Schallenberger. I'm not a doctor. These people are doctors, and they're saying that all this stuff about nanocrystals, luciferase, genetic engineering should worry us. Well, if we need to worry about pharmaceutical companies and about the government, be suspicious of them because clearly sometimes they are dishonest, we should also be a little bit cautious about believing the first thing that someone who says they have a medical degree tells us. Carrie Madej has a medical degree. She is a doctor, but she's also been dishonest when talking about tetanus vaccines, suggesting that the only reason a person would need a tetanus vaccine, women of childbearing age, is to make them sterile, that's why tetanus campaigns target these women. The truth is that women of childbearing age, if they're likely to give birth in unsanitary conditions, if they're in a third world country, or if they're in poverty-stricken areas or areas where there's drug use, where there's a chance the mother or someone in her family might be a drug user, and therefore they're in a condition where they could give birth at home or in an unsanitary setting, at the moment when the umbilical cord is cut, that's a very high-risk moment for tetanus infections. And these infections do in fact occur, despite Carrie Madej saying the contrary. You can look online for people who have gotten tetanus, and unfortunately, people do get it. It's very severe, and people pass away every year because of this. So, despite her being a doctor, there's something there that makes me think she's not entirely honest, because she doesn't mention any of this when she says tetanus is only given to the tetanus vaccine to women of childbearing age in some countries. No, they're the first to get it because they're at the highest risk if they give birth in an unsanitary setting. Rashid Buttar authored a book on gemstone energy medicine, which is available online. You can buy it. Now, I personally don't trust a person who believes in gemstone energy medicine, that gemstone energy can somehow heal us or help our body recover from disease, to give me good medical advice, even though he does have a medical license. He's a licensed physician. Frank Schallenberger actually has several malpractice lawsuits in his past, in the 90s, including giving a woman who had already gone through breast cancer a completely useless and probably expensive treatment for which he was sued, where he actually told the woman that this was FDA-approved experimental treatment. And of course, it wasn't true. The FDA has never approved ozone therapy for treating anything. So sometimes it pays to look at the sources as well. Of course, when we first see a person, we don't know everything about them. But if we start to believe, one person versus another, we should know a little more about their background, know if they actually have been trustworthy in the past. And I would suggest that in the cases of the people I just mentioned, there's good reason to be suspicious about their intentions and their actions because they haven't been reliable in the past. What about the idea that in any event, this vaccine seems to give the government a whole lot of control? And maybe it's paving the way for a situation where the government has more control and is able to manipulate people more. Well, from a Christian perspective, we need to think about when this has happened in the past. The Bible describes a moment when the Roman Empire, clearly an evil empire, where the emperor himself declared himself God in certain moments, desecrated the temple. The Roman Empire tried to extend its control over the population, over the people under its control, by forcing them to return to their hometowns to be registered so that they could tax them and they could know who they were, where they were from, who they were related to, their connections. We all know what happened in that story. Joseph and Mary don't organize a rebellion when they're told they have to return to Joseph's place of birth so that they can be registered so the government can better tax them and have better control over them. They simply obey because they don't care. However evil the empire may be, however much control they may be trying to exert and how much they try to extend their control, they were doing God's will. And they knew that ultimately God had more control than the Roman Empire. And in fact, that's how the story played out in the end. Revelation chapter 13 gives us the same approach. Time after time, we're told that the beast will be given authority. God decides when and for how long he will have authority. It's not up to us to organize an end times novel type revolution to hold things off or boycott a certain vaccine for fear that that may someday open the doors. This will happen. God has declared that it will happen. He also declared when, and he will bring it to an end because he has ultimate control over the situation. So it's not something that we need to be living in fear of. We need to know the instructions, how to behave. Revelation tells us that this calls for perseverance from the saints, faithfulness, not fear and not trying to find a way to make sure the government never expands its control over our lives. Not that the vaccine would actually do that, but if your thought is that it might, this is something you should consider as well. Well, what can we do in the meantime? We need to be considerate about those who have had the coronavirus. When we keep saying things like, oh, only people who are going to die anyway die of COVID, besides not being true, it's very hurtful, very disrespectful to people who have passed away because of the coronavirus. I personally have lost people I know and care about because of the coronavirus, and they were fine a few months ago, and they're not with us anymore. And it's disrespectful to make it sound like, who cares, they would have died anyway. It's not true. And we need to show love and appreciation for those who are working to spare lives, not returning evil for good, but recognizing the good that people, however fallible, are trying to do, and trying to repay good for good. And where there is evil, where there is fear, where there is suspicion, we need to overcome the evil with good. And what about if we've forwarded or shared, maybe you're concerned, you forwarded a movie by Carrie Madej without knowing that she's been dishonest in the things she says, or Rashid Buttar not knowing that he believes in gemstone energy. Well, now you know, and now you have a chance to continue the conversation with your friends and contacts. Give them some more information that you didn't know before, now you have access to. And that may balance, how much we trust or distrust these people. We need to know why we consider them to be reliable. Have they been trustworthy or not? So test all things, hold to what is good, and ultimately remember to overcome evil with good.